No.
No, carry on.
Here.
Well, I mean, this crazy place. Fellow peers, this is the third maiden speech I've made in my 3 phases of parliamentary life. First in the House of Commons, then in the European Parliament, and now in this historic House. Some maiden, you may say, after 45 years of public life. Indeed, a journalist said to me at lunchtime today that politics must be the only profession in which one could be a maiden for 3 times. And so the House will understand if I feel more than usually irked by the conventions attaching to a maiden speech. And I am also very conscious of the fact that we're all got half our minds on the excitements going on in another place, you know, with dead sheep and dead parrots leaping to life all over the place. But nonetheless, I do feel that this is a good moment for me to make my maiden speech, because it is a moment in which both this House and another place are deeply exercised in their minds about what should be Britain's relationship to the European community. Now, I have watched for 10 years in the European Parliament the British government muddling through a love-hate relationship with the European community, willing to wound and afraid to leave. And indeed, you know, it has been very interesting that the European Parliament, and indeed the members of the Commission, had a greater respect, I might almost say affection, for those of us who had been overtly against Britain's membership in the first place and remained highly critical. They felt at least that there was there a sincerity and a curious kind of comradeship, whereas the British government continued to patronise them. The Prime Minister, even when she was conducting a very legitimate battle to reduce Britain's contribution to European funds, outraged the Parliament by talking about our money, when she, not I, had voted for Britain's entry into the community on terms which meant we clearly earmarked part of our money to be their own resources. And all along, they felt there was something deeply insincere about the British government's attitude. Oh, they talked about being good Europeans. And, of course, the Prime Minister at Stuttgart and other summits signed the communiqué pledging herself, along with the rest, to proceed rapidly towards European Union. And then, ever since, has complained that the others didn't know what they meant by it. And, of course, she enthusiastically endorsed the internal market. We were some of the prime instigators in it. And now she complains about the threat to national sovereignty. What is the internal market but a threat to national sovereignty? Because it's far more than just a wider commercial market. It is the introduction of a situation into which any community firm or community worker or community professional will have equal rights in our own country as the British ones have. And so, finally, she takes us into the exchange rate mechanism simply as a sop, a political sop to her own restive party conference. Don't think this doesn't go observed over there in Europe. They're not fools, you know. They've got us all sized up. And she took us in on the worst of all possible terms. Madrid forgotten. She's taken us in on an overvalued currency. Right. At a time of record inflation in Europe, at a time of the worst balance of payments situation in Europe, one of the lowest growths in Europe, and in a situation in which we are least well equipped to deal with its disciplines.
That's right.
And so, no wonder that the Chancellor of the Exchequer tells us, admits it at last, it's dragged out of him, that we are in this country heading for a recession. We said it's moderate. That's not what the CBI says of it. That's not what the CBI survey reveals. So it's a recession, and in 1991 it's going to get worse. He admits growth in this country will fall to 0.5%. Unemployment will rise. Perhaps by 1 million, certainly well over 2 million. And already under the constraints of this recession, made worse by the terms of our membership of the ERM and the way we went into it, firms in this country are cutting back on the investment of which we are already so dangerously short. And look at the small businesses some of the speakers have been referring to earlier. I was in my local butcher's shop only the other day. Nice, prosperous little local butcher's shop. And he said to me, Mrs. Castle, if this goes on, I'll be shut in 6 months' time. And that's happening all over this country. And the way in which we've tied ourselves to a new form of the gold standard can only make that matter worse. And so we are now faced, as a country, because the economists tell us, of course, you know, ERM's only the start, it will lead us irresistibly onto a single currency and a European central bank. And that faces this country with a dreadful choice. It's the economists who are enlightening us all on all these complex matters have pointed out in column after column of the business sections of our great national newspapers. We're at last belatedly got to face the choice into which we have drifted as a result of this government's policy. Either we will have to go forward into greater monetary union, which will wreak havoc on our weakened economy, or we're going to be left out. Now, I don't like either of those choices, and I don't think the majority of the members of this House like it either. So what are we to do? We've left it very late. Perhaps too late. But one always has to work constructively for hope, for a third way, and I believe there is just an outside chance of a third way, of a way in which we could at last regain the ear of the European community, which is now closed to us by the Prime Minister's style, not only by her style, but by her philosophy. And I think the way is this. I know from my direct experience in the European Parliament, where I had so many good friends with whom I could argue constructively and affectionately, I know from them that their desire for union is very strong and very deep. I remember talking to a couple of young Belgian socialists, and they said, you know, Barbara, we were born into the community. We don't like a lot of it any more than you do, but we've never known anything else. That is a scenario that you won't alter by lecturing and hectoring and bullying. You've got to understand it. And they do want integration, closer integration, but what has happened? Because of so much confusion of thought in Europe, it is the financiers, the bankers, the big boys, the city boys, who have jumped in and turned that desire for greater integration into their form of monetary and economic union, with all the consequences we all know for the weaker economies. Why? The Chancellor of the Exchequer himself said the other day, and to Peter Jay on the money programme at the BBC, that to go for a single currency with so many unequal economies in Europe would lead to massive unemployment and massive movements of population from the weaker areas to the more prosperous ones. My heavens, he must have been reading my speeches. And he's right, of course. But what has he done as the alternative? And I tell you what, there is the alternative, for which the European community itself is crying out. The alternative is a planned community policy to create the conversions between the stronger and weaker economies, which at present does not exist. And we know, don't we? We're in the weaker economies classification. Herr Pohl told us it during his recent visit to London. Oh, weaker economies shouldn't join a monetary union because they couldn't stand the pace. They'd better stay out and wait a bit. And he meant us. Now, I tell you, Europe doesn't like the idea of the community people don't like the idea of a two-speed Europe either. But certainly not the people in the European Parliament. I've heard as much talk about the need for convergence, for bringing the economies closer together in that body, than I've heard about mechanistic monetary union. We've passed billions of reports and resolutions on the need for stronger regional policy, for a battle against unemployment, for the helping of the smaller man, for the extension of training standards, for the harmonization of the human elements, the treatment of the elderly, guaranteeing them a minimum standard of life, a fight for women's rights. All these things have occupied the European Parliament. That's what they mean by the European community, a people's Europe that shall bring the lowest up to the standard of the best. And even the strongest economies, like Germany, know that's absolutely essential if the community is ever to work. We had a debate the other day on monetary and economic union, I remember, on the internal market, actually. And I remember a Portuguese socialist getting up and saying, reminding the Parliament that a worker in a German factory earned 8 times as much as a Portuguese worker in the same type of factory. Germany doesn't want that. She can see the whole thing will blow up in our faces unless we harmonize in the most constructive way. And I tell you why. The community is alienated from our British government, not merely because of the Prime Minister's border chariot-type nationalism, but because of her 19th century Victorian values that are out of date. Unregulated free enterprise, keep government out. She said, when she rejected Jacques Delors' Charter of Fundamental Social Rights, she said, I'm not going to have socialism brought in by the back door. Oh no, you don't think those remarks don't go unnoted? Why should they listen to us? We're no longer strong, and we're not listening to them. Nor are we cooperating in a great community effort to lift the economic standards throughout the whole community to the level of the best. So the issue is this. We should lead that campaign in Europe, saying convergence must come before monetary union. The market economy and monetary union left to itself will make matters worse. And I believe there are millions of voices ready to listen to us in the European community.
My lords,
I should like to begin by adding my congratulations to my noble friend, Lady Castle, for her maiden speech. It seemed to me this afternoon that running through many of the themes has been a rather fresh breeze. I don't know whether she's already having the effect on us that she had on the European Parliament, but certainly the robust frankness that she expressed in her speech has been reproduced in the speeches of many others. And for myself, I'm beginning to feel rather at home. And I trust I shall be able to continue in this particular vein. I listened this morning to Mr. Kenneth Baker on the radio. Indeed, I always seem to be listening to Mr. Kenneth Baker on the radio. And he told me that there has been a fundamental transformation in the fortunes of our country. A fundamental transformation in the fortunes of our country. And in the same programme, John Coe referred to some other Conservative who said that the government has effected an economic miracle. Well, in the robust spirit which has characterised us so far, who do they think they're kidding? This is absolutely absurd. Mrs. Thatcher herself made the brazen comment at the Guildhall that she had broken the post-war mould of bureaucracy and decline. Well, it's a new line. Usually she just blames my noble friend Lord Wilson and myself for what has happened. But this time, Lord Boyd Carpenter had better note she includes him. It is not just the government that I led and the government that was led by my noble friend Lord Wilson, but the government that was led by Mr. Heath. Well, perhaps that's not surprising. It was the government that was led by Lord Hume and by Mr. Sir Anthony Eden and by, of course, Harold Macmillan and by Mr. Churchill and by Mr. Attlee. And, of course, the noble Lord himself is very ready to condemn Mr. Attlee's government, that I noticed, but he can't escape being part of the bureaucratic mould which the Prime Minister herself has removed during the last few years. I see he's anxious to intervene.
My Lord, I hope my noble Lord Callaghan will withdraw the charge against me of having been a member of Mr. Heath's government.
What I said was... Well,
Mrs. Thatcher was.
I apologise to Mr. Heath and congratulate the noble Lord.